Hello, welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm covering a case that was actually submitted by one of my subscribers, which is so exciting for me because this is the very first subscriber requested case that I'm actually covering on this channel. So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you so much for this request. I had never even heard of this case, and I don't know if I would have heard of it if it hadn't been suggested to me, and it's a really interesting one. Once I started looking into this case, I thought it would be the perfect way to kick off my Valentine's Day series. So from today, February 1st, up until Valentine's Day, I'm going to be posting a new video every other day, highlighting cases that are kind of centered around love gone wrong, three-way, love triangles, things like that. And like I said, I thought that this would be a really good case to kick off the series with. So at the very center of this story is a man named John Rutten. He studied mechanical engineering at UCLA from 1978 until 1982. During this time, John casually dated a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. They were never officially in a relationship, but the two of them were casually romantically involved on and off for quite some time. They bonded over the fact that they were both athletes and attended the same university. Stephanie was studying political science at UCLA when she met John, and she would later go on to become a member of the Los Angeles Police Department, the LAPD. Now, Stephanie always seemed to be more invested in her relationship with John than he was in his relationship with her. Throughout their time together, Stephanie behaved pretty strangely on many occasions. There were times that John was asleep and Stephanie would take nude pictures of him, and she had also been known to take his clothes when he was in the shower and hide them from him. John never considered the relationship to be anything serious, and to him, Stephanie was just someone he could have fun with and fool around with. He never made a commitment, and he didn't have a deep love for her or anything like that. However, I'm not so sure that Stephanie knew that, and if she did not feel the same way. For John's 25th birthday, Stephanie threw him a party, and she had no idea that he had been involved with anyone besides her. She was completely surprised when she learned that John was in a committed relationship with a woman named Sherri Rasmussen. Now, I've seen it pronounced a couple different ways, Rasmussen. I'm going to say Rasmussen. I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Sherri was a truly exceptional human being. She was a critical care nurse, and she had actually started college at the age of 16. And a few years later, she became the director of nursing at the Glendale Medical Center. Sherri was a very compassionate person, as most people who enter into the nursing field are, and when Stephanie learned of Sherri and John's relationship, she wrote a letter to John's mother, where she said, "I'm truly in love with John, and the last year has really torn me up. I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand John's decision." Although John was with Sherri, he still had some romantic encounters with Stephanie, if you know what I mean. There was even an incident where Stephanie showed up to John and Sherri's condo with a pair of skis, asking John to wax them for her. And despite the fact that Sherri was opposed to this idea, John did the favor for Stephanie anyway. This was a red flag for Sherri, since Stephanie showed up in a really flattering athletic outfit, and honestly, Sherri could probably just tell that there was some kind of chemistry still between them. So Sherri asked John if things were truly over between him and Stephanie, and John told Sherri that she had nothing to worry about because he and Stephanie were just friends. A few days after Stephanie had dropped her skis off, she showed up at the condo when John wasn't there, and she was in her uniform and armed, which gave Sherri a really unsettling feeling. Sherri was so disturbed by Stephanie's visits that she actually begged John to tell Stephanie to leave them alone and to stop visiting their condo. However, John once again did not stand with his fiancée, and instead he told her that she had nothing to worry about and to just ignore Stephanie if it bothered her so much. Stephanie's visits did not stop, and on one occasion, Stephanie visited Sherri at work where she told her that things were actually not over between Stephanie and John. Stephanie even said that if she couldn't have John, no one could, which unfortunately is a very common mentality with these kinds of cases. Stephanie's odd behavior continued, and eventually Sherri confided in her father that she believed Stephanie had been stalking her. At one point, John confessed to Sherri that he had casually seen Stephanie while he and Sherri were still engaged. Sherri, although she was upset, told John that if they were to move forward with their wedding, he would need to leave his relationship with Stephanie in the past, to which John agreed. In November of 1985, Sherri and John got married. Everything in Sherri's life seemed to be perfect. She was newlywed to the man of her dreams, she had a thriving career, and she was well loved by all who knew her. In fact, Sherri was described as a beacon of light by those who were close to her. Unfortunately, Sherri's newlywed bliss would only last a few short months because on February 24th of 1986, just 3 months after Sherri's wedding to John, Sherri decided to take a personal day off of work. She had told her superior that she was staying home due to an aerobics injury she had gotten the day before, but the real reason Sherri stayed home was because she was supposed to give a presentation and she wasn't very keen on the subject matter and didn't find it to be worth her time. Before John left for work, Sherri told him that she would likely be staying home for the day, and so John left for work, and throughout the day, he tried calling his wife at home several times, with the first call being made around 10 a.m. Sherri's sister had also tried calling her that day, but she was unable to reach her. Around 9:45 that morning, a neighbor noticed that the garage door to Sherri and John's home was left open, but there was no car parked inside. Around noon that day, 2 men who were thought to be gardeners found a handbag that belonged to Sherri left outside, and a few moments later, around 12:30 in the afternoon, a nearby maid reports that she heard the sounds of 2 people fighting and eventually what sounded like someone falling. John returned home from work and was surprised to find his garage door left open. He also found broken glass scattered along his driveway. Something even more strange became clear to John. The BMW that John had purchased for Sherri was nowhere to be found. John knew that it was very unlikely that Sherri had left the house that day, since earlier she had called out of work. John entered the condo, and that is where he found the body of his recent bride. Sherri was laying on the living room floor, and it was clear that she had been shot 3 times. The house was in disarray, and there were signs of a struggle between Sherri and her attacker. A porcelain vase was shattered, and it was later discovered that Sherri had been hit over the head with it prior to being shot. There was a bloody handprint next to the alarm system's panic button, and it was evident that someone had attempted to bind Sherri. Sherri had an injury on her face, which was determined to have been caused by her attacker hitting her with the muzzle of the gun. Sherri also had multiple defensive wounds. Sherri had been shot through a quilted blanket, and it is believed that this was done to muffle the sound of the gunshots. Another strange detail is that Sherri had also been bitten on her arm. During the initial investigation, police believed that Sherri had been ambushed by her attackers, who intended just to burglarize the home. Sherri was dressed in a nightgown and robe, which suggested that she had no intention of having any visitors over that morning. A pile of electronics was left at the scene of the crime, and police believed the burglar had gone around the house gathering items to steal when Sherri walked up on them. They believed the burglar shot and killed Sherri and then fled the scene, using her BMW as a getaway car. No jewelry or electronics had been taken from the home. Aside from the BMW, the only other item that was taken happened to be Sherri and John's marriage license. John was ultimately ruled out as a suspect, and although John as well as Sherri's father both informed the police that Stephanie had exhibited threatening behavior towards Sherri, detectives did not pursue this because they strongly believed Sherri had been a victim of a burglary gone wrong. This theory seemed to be strengthened because around the same time, there was another burglary that took place, and one of the suspects had been caught carrying a .38 caliber pistol, the same weapon Sherri had been shot with. One thing that the detectives found very strange was the fact that Sherri had been bitten by her attacker. And this is because, statistically, women are found to be more likely to inflict wounds by biting than males. However, most burglars happen to be men, causing these two statistics to cancel each other out. This did not end up being enough to outrule the burglary theory, and so that is what police stuck with. Sherri's family offered a large reward for any information that would lead to the alleged burglars who took Sherri's life. The LAPD was quick to label the crime as a burglary gone wrong, and due to them being overwhelmed by the drug epidemic and surge of gang violence that had broken out throughout the city, Sherri's case eventually fell cold. Sherri's family refused to accept this, and they made every possible effort to keep Sherri's case active. They would often make phone calls to the police, and rather than giving the grieving family any support, police would hang up on them or give the family a hard time for calling about a case they believed to be cold and already solved. Sherri's father never let the case go and kept putting the offer for a reward out there to the public. He also publicly called out the police department and requested more action from them. Sherri's father even wrote to the police chief, explaining that he believed Stephanie had been involved. His letter was not taken seriously, and police responded by telling him that he watched too much television. Sherri's father refused to give up and continued to publicly offer a reward for any information that could help solve Sherri's case. He even went on to work with a TV series by the name of Murder One, where they did a segment based on Sherri's case. Her father remained unconvinced that his daughter had been taken down by a burglar because, in his words, Sherri was a tall woman. She was over 6 feet tall and she was in good physical shape. He knew that not just anyone would be able to take down his daughter. It had also been discovered that the altercation between Sherri and her attacker had lasted anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, which would be an awfully long time for the burglar to spend in the home. It was also very strange that whoever killed Sherri had taken the time to wrap her in a quilt in an effort to muffle the sound of the gunshots. The shots were fired at close range and directly into Sherri's chest, which showed that it had been done intentionally. Years later, the case would receive more attention thanks to recent advancements with DNA technology. The detectives were looking at cases that might be able to be solved with new forms of DNA testing, and they revisited the cold case. Detectives decided that some of the evidence taken from Sherri and John's residence would be perfect to retest. However, there wasn't a real break in the case until many years later, in 2004, a woman named Jennifer Francis was finally able to properly analyze the DNA, and although she wasn't able to determine much, one thing that she was able to determine was that the suspect's DNA taken from the crime scene belonged to a female. Jennifer wasn't able to find a match to the DNA, but knowing that female DNA had been found at the scene really made the burglary theory very unlikely. Jennifer later gained access to the entire case file of Sherri's murder and began to look over all of the prior evidence and information surrounding Sherri's murder. She soon stumbled across allegations of a woman who had been stalking and terrorizing Sherri, and Jennifer found it very odd that this woman had never been looked into by prior investigators. In fact, once Jennifer brought this up to the other detectives, they told her that they knew exactly who the woman in question was, but that she wasn't part of the crime, and suggested that Jennifer let it go. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened for a few more years. By the year of 2009, crime rates in LA had decreased significantly. Since detectives didn't have as many new cases, they started looking through old ones. This is where Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba stumbled across Sherri's murder. Knowing that there is a female involved in the case, they decided that the burglary theory was probably invalid, and they decided to start from the ground up. Instead of considering the possibility of a burglary, they viewed the case as a murder. They decided that many things ruled out the possibility of a burglary. Sherri had a jewelry box out on her dresser showcasing many items that would appeal to a burglar, yet it was untouched. The crime took place in daylight, in the middle of a gated community that had alarm systems in place. Robbers would probably know better than to target a property that had surveillance during broad daylight. And amongst other things, there was no sign of a break-in. If a burglar had broken into Sherri's home without her knowledge, there would have been signs of forced entry. Another interesting and odd detail is that the stack of electronics seemed to be staged, since it is believed that if a burglar had placed it down while they murdered Sherri, it would have been knocked over during the struggle. This was later backed up by a bloody thumbprint found on a record player that had been stacked with the other items, proving that it was placed there after Sherri had already been shot. The blood was Sherri's, and the killer had likely been wearing gloves since they weren't able to get a print from the bloodstain. And again, if it was a burglary, they wouldn't have left a stack of electronics behind. The detectives started to believe that these items were left there to give the illusion of a burglary. There were a few different female suspects that the police looked into. Of course, none of these leads went anywhere. It wasn't until the current detectives found out that one of the suspects, Stephanie Lazarus, was a police officer, and that's what made them decide to look into her further. Stephanie Lazarus had made an impressive career for herself. After working with LAPD for years, she started up her own private investigation firm. Stephanie was awarded medals for her work as a police officer and soon became promoted to a detective. She specifically worked as an art theft detective. Stephanie had gotten married to a fellow officer, and the two of them had later adopted a daughter together. Stephanie had received media attention for being one of the only 2 detectives in her specific field in the nation. After retrieving a statue that had been stolen, she was praised in the media for her hard work. This is when the detectives working on Sherri's case realized that Stephanie was still an active member of the police force. They knew that moving forward, they would have to be very careful with how they approached Stephanie. Not only was Stephanie an active officer, but her husband was as well. The detectives did not know if Stephanie had any other friends in the workforce that might be able to tip her off if they were to hear anything. There was also the concern that if Stephanie was not guilty of the crime, it would reflect badly on them for accusing a fellow officer of something as vicious as murder. The detectives referred to Stephanie as suspect number 5 and worked on the case in secret. As they looked into Stephanie more and more, detectives realized that at the time of Sherri's murder, most officers used a .38 caliber pistol, which was the exact weapon that had been used to kill Sherri. An interesting thing to note, though, is that officers had a tendency to use that as their off-duty backup weapon. Detectives were able to confirm that Stephanie did in fact own this exact weapon at the time. And oddly enough, she had reported it stolen just 13 days after Sherri's murder. Nuttall and Barba decided to put themselves in the mindset of a police officer who wanted to commit a murder. They determined that it would be best to commit the crime on a day off, which they were able to confirm through records that Stephanie had indeed been off of work on the same day of Sherri's murder. They also figured it would make a lot more sense to use their off-duty weapon as opposed to their active-duty weapon, because if Stephanie were to have used her everyday weapon, it would be a lot easier to trace, and the penalty for losing an active-duty weapon was much more severe. Stephanie also would know just how to stage the crime scene to make it look as though it was a burglary rather than a homicide. It started to become clear to the detectives that Stephanie could very well be the perpetrator they'd been looking for. Knowing that they had to be 100% sure before they could move forward with bringing Stephanie in for questioning, Nuttall and Barba decided that the best thing they could do would be to tie Stephanie's DNA to the sample that had been collected from the crime scene. One day, while Stephanie was out running errands, the detectives followed her and gathered a cup that Stephanie had been drinking from. Police were able to test the cup for DNA, and the DNA that they retrieved from the cup was an exact match to the DNA that had been left at the crime scene. Police now had exactly what they needed to move forward. Since the police would be investigating a fellow officer, they were given as little information as possible. Superiors told the officers that they were searching a home outside of the city limits so that no one would be able to tip off Stephanie or let it slip that a fellow officer was the main suspect in a murder investigation. Police officers with the least possible connection to Stephanie were chosen to perform the search of her property. Detectives arranged for Stephanie to be brought into the basement area of the department that she worked at, knowing that this would require her to surrender her weapons, making it nearly impossible that she would be able to retaliate violently against them once she was arrested. The detectives called Stephanie in for questioning, and rather than telling her it was because of a crime which she was the suspect of, they told her it was because there was an art theft case that they needed her input on. Before I go forward with the details of Stephanie's investigation, I want to note that there is a video of the entire interrogation, and I'm going to link it down below. There's about an hour's worth of footage, and it is some of the strangest behavior I've ever seen from a suspect. There have been a lot of videos analyzing Stephanie's behavior during this investigation, and I'll link some of those down below as well. It is really worth a watch, and it gives you a lot of insight into what exactly is happening, because like I said, Stephanie's behavior is just totally strange. So once Stephanie signed her weapons over at the station and went back to the interrogation room, officers informed her that she wasn't actually there because of an art theft case, but instead that they were actually trying to tie up some loose ends in relation to the Sherri Rasmussen case. Detectives told Stephanie that they wanted to do it privately since, although she and John had not been involved in years, they didn't want to stir up any drama in an effort to spare Stephanie and her husband of any gossip. The detectives had to be very careful because Stephanie was keen on normal interrogation techniques. The detectives started asking Stephanie questions about her relationship with John and how exactly she knew him. Stephanie tells them that she and John went to school together and that they dated. And it's important to note that Stephanie continuously trails off after answering questions, asking, "What's this all about anyway?" And she repeatedly asks why she is being questioned about someone she knew a million years ago. Detectives ask Stephanie if she had known John's wife, and Stephanie pretends that she isn't quite sure of her name and says that she isn't even sure if she ever met her. When police ask Stephanie if she had known about what happened to Sherri, Stephanie says that she knew that Sherri got killed, and kind of diverts the conversation by saying things like, "Geez, let me think back. Gee, I don't know. Gosh, that was a million years ago." Stephanie is clearly very nervous and anxious during this interrogation. She often laughs nervously and gives really vague answers. A really common answer that Stephanie gives is, "I don't think so." For example, when asked if she and Sherri had gotten into a fight, she says, "I don't think so." And it's just really strange because if someone were to accuse an innocent person of something like that, they would deny it up and down. They would never just say, "I don't think we got into a fight. I don't think so. Not that I remember." Stephanie asks if she can leave, and when she does, she is met by other officers outside of the interrogation room, where she is placed under arrest. At this time, police started searching Stephanie's home and car, where they found a journal that Stephanie had documented her love and feelings for John in, as well as the heartbreak she endured and her hatred for Sherri. Stephanie's computer revealed that she often searched for John on the internet. Stephanie was charged with Sherri's murder and was kept at the LA County Jail. Stephanie's bail was set at $10 million, not only because this case against her was so strong, but also because she was considered a high flight risk, or at the very least, someone who would be able to obtain weapons because of her husband's job as a police officer. Stephanie's lawyer, Mark Overland, tried to get the case thrown out. He said that the investigators who were first assigned to the case should have suspected Stephanie, and because they failed to do so, he didn't believe there was currently much of a case. Overland also stated that the initial investigation failed to document and bring forward key points, such as Sherri's blood toxicology and the fact that John had apparently failed a polygraph test. Stephanie's lawyer believed that since so much time had passed, and even though Sherri's father had been asking police to look into Stephanie for years, Stephanie's right to due process had been sabotaged. He believed that the quality of evidence couldn't hold up after all these years, resulting in the inability to give Stephanie a fair trial. Overland also said that any evidence collected from the recent search on Stephanie's home and other properties was not valid, since she had not moved into that home until 1994, years after the murder. Overland's next motion was to throw out things Stephanie said during her interrogation, because he believed that since she did not originally know she was being questioned as a suspect, Stephanie answered from the viewpoint of a police officer rather than from the viewpoint of a suspect. The trial began in the early part of 2012. The prosecution stated that Stephanie's motive for murdering Sherri was her jealousy and obsessive love for John. John took the stand and gave a moving testimony where he broke down as he reflected on his love for Sherri. John stated that his relationship with Stephanie was a mistake, showing great remorse and regret. Stephanie's lawyer maintained that Sherri's murder was linked to a nearby robbery that happened around the same time. He made many attempts to back up that claim by focusing on evidence such as bloody fingerprints on the walls that could have belonged to someone besides Stephanie. Overland also argued that since the .38 caliber pistol was such a common weapon at the time, it couldn't be determined that it was Stephanie's exact weapon that was used on Sherri. He also stated that the DNA from the bite mark was not reliable because he claimed it had not been properly stored. Close friends of Stephanie's testified on her behalf, stating that she showed no signs of violence at the time of Sherri's murder. Stephanie's journal was often brought forward as evidence, stating that she had dated many different men at that time. The defense tried to use this to showcase that if she was dating multiple men, it was unlikely that she was still hung up on John. A fingerprint analyst also testified that there were some fingerprints found at the scene of the crime that did not belong to Stephanie. The jury was made up of 8 women and 4 men. They were shown pictures from the crime scene that showed how badly Sherri had been beaten, to which one prosecutor said, "This wasn't a fair fight. This was prey caught in a cage with a predator." Although Stephanie's lawyer pushed for a mistrial, after several days the jury found her guilty and convicted her of first-degree murder. Stephanie was sentenced to a minimum of 27 years in prison, with a maximum of a life sentence. She received credit for time served, and so, although she is currently serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women, she will be eligible for parole in 2034. One thing that I do want to shed some light on is that there were many key points of evidence missing from Sherri's file. The transcripts and recordings from interviews with Sherri's father as well as John had been discarded. Although both John and Sherri's father vividly remember bringing forth information about Stephanie, there was no trace of it in the file, which unfortunately most likely means it was thrown out by police in an effort to protect Stephanie. Sherri's parents sued the police department for ignoring evidence that could have led to the capture of their daughter's killer much, much sooner. Another lawsuit was filed by Jennifer Francis, the woman who initially linked the DNA to a female perpetrator. However, both lawsuits ended in favor of the city and the police department. Sherri's father firmly believes his daughter's murder was covered up by the police department. I also want to note that Stephanie was allowed to retire early from the police force, even though she was suspected of murder. In 2013, Stephanie filed an appeal for her conviction. A panel of 3 judges was put together to hear Stephanie's case, and in 2015 they reached a unanimous decision to uphold her murder conviction. Some have speculated that John had some involvement in Sherri's murder, but there has never been any evidence to support that. However, it is confirmed that he did continue to have a casual relationship with Stephanie even after Sherri's murder. As it stands right now, Stephanie is currently in jail serving time, but I think that justice could have been served so much sooner if the police department hadn't been so corrupt and had just done the right thing and looked into Stephanie as a suspect. Sherri's dad never gave up on seeking justice for his daughter. There were times that he even offered to pay for DNA testing out of his own pocket. And I think it's important to acknowledge just how big of a role he played, and I don't think that his daughter's murder would have been solved if it weren't for him consistently demanding that Stephanie be looked into. This is a classic case of a love triangle gone wrong, and it is really unfortunate that Sherri was taken away from the people who loved her at such a young age. I'm glad that she was able to get justice somehow, though it is a shame that it did take so long. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you took the time to go watch the video of Stephanie's interrogation, let me know what you think of her behavior. As always, keep it respectful in the comments. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Sherri's case, and please give this video a like. I hope that you subscribe because I have a lot more content like this coming your way. Turn on the post notifications so that you'll be notified every time I upload a new video, and I will catch you in the next one.